Welcome back to another episode of the Meaningful People podcast. We sat down this week with Judge Dan Butler. We spoke about so many interesting topics. Boy, the life he has lived and continues to live is amazing. Besides for being a judge for decades, having his hand in, resolving and mediating so many divorces, not just in the secular world, but in the Jewish world, Dan lives in Squirrel Hill, a small residential neighborhood in Pittsburgh, where the Tree of Life synagogue shooting happened. We talk all about that, surviving that, thriving through that, bouncing back from that in that community. In addition, Dan has lost his son, Mikey, to a terrible disease. We touch so many different topics, and there's just overall a ton of inspiration and a ton to learn from in this episode. So I hope you go ahead and listen and enjoy the rest of this episode.
Welcome to the Meaningful People podcast, the podcast where we talk to people who are
meaningful.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Judge Dan Butler.
Yeah. You're the first, I think, I could be wrong, I'm always
first
wrong.
Judge?
I think you're the first judge that we're having on Meaningful People.
Maybe it'll start a whole new thing.
Yeah. There are other judges that you think we should have?
I have no idea.
Not
Jewish ones.
Right. Yeah, they could still be meaningful. You never know.
You have to understand where
I
live,
guess
there are 40-some judges in the county. It has about 2 million people. On the week of December 25th, because we're open 24/7, I'm there 16 hours a day because I'm the only Jewish one. Forget about from. I'm the only Jewish one.
So I guess take us through your childhood, your growing up, the community that you're growing up in. You've lived in Pittsburgh your entire life?
Right. Several years ago, nobody in America had heard of Squirrel Hill. Now people have because that's where the Tree of Life is.
That's where the shooting was a couple years ago. Squirrel Hill.
And I grew up in Squirrel Hill. In fact, in a very strange circumstance, I live where I've always lived, in the exact same place my entire life.
When you say place, you mean the same community or you mean the same house?
Same address.
Whoa. Interesting.
To give you some idea, after World War II, my father and my uncle were partners, and they bought Thomas Edison's sister's house, a giant house.
Get out of here. Thomas Edison's sister.
Yeah, and they each took 2 floors, and they each had 4 kids, and they put their parents in the carriage house in the back. It is before they had kids, they started the day school in the community and put it next door.
Convenient.
So that now, many, many years later, we have the same compound. I live in the carriage house. My children and grandchildren live in what we call the big house. And my grandchildren go through the bushes to the day school next door. Along our driveway is the Butler base medrash.
Really?
Yeah.
So your family kind of is the root of like Orthodox Judaism in
My grandfather, who lived in the house I live in now, was the first mashgiach for the first OU product, which was Heinz ketchup.
That's the first.
That's a good trivia question.
Yeah,
what is the first? Heinz ketchup. Heinz ketchup was the first OU product?
Yep.
Was there such a need for kosher ketchup back then that was?
Well, it was the first national hashgacha. There was that was.
And
they really sat in on the meetings where they made the U with the circle around it.
Oh wow! And Heinz is stems from Pittsburgh.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
Heinz.
Does it say it on like every bottle?
No, the stadium, the Pittsburgh Steelers play in.
It's called Heinz
Field.
Yeah.
I should be more into sports because then I'll know.
You'll know more things, maybe.
Yeah, that's true. So you're in Pittsburgh for forever,
right?
And you're a judge now. What was there a particular event in your life that you said, did you want to become a judge or you want to be a lawyer?
It's such a hard thing to aspire to unless your father is the president's best friend and you're going to be appointed someday to a federal judgeship. It's not something you can really plan for.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, unless you're the one who's mending the relationships between your friends who are fighting in the schoolyard. You would be a great judge.
Right. But sometimes you turn into a caterer or a doctor.
Right.
So take us through that, I guess, that process of,
Well, for me, it was really much simpler. When I became a lawyer, my first job was as a law clerk to a judge in family court. And almost right away, we had our first child. And he had cystic fibrosis. And that was 50% of the time for the rest of his life, he was in the hospital. And the big fear was having a pre-existing condition. The big fear was not being covered. So I stayed in government employment ever since.
Because, and which
Because
son,
of the-
which
because of the
son
ho-
was this?
Our oldest son, Mikey.
This was Mikey.
Yeah, he eventually graduated YU. Great story.
We're open for stories. Our
Yeah,
listeners
well,
love stories.
May as well get right into it.
Yeah.
I mean, you're hinting to he has cystic fibrosis and he lived seems like a regular normal life. He graduated from YU. And
Well, when you consider the fact that his entire life, he spent 50% in the hospital.
right.
So that's pretty unusual. But one of
It's
his
pretty incredible to graduate from Yeshiva University while spending.
one of his big goals was to go to Yeshiva University for one semester. It wasn't really realistic for a kid who's on oxygen, has to carry an oxygen tank around, or
Right.
cart one around really, and who takes 50, 60, 70 doses of medication a day around the clock and has to have what they call chest compressions because cystic fibrosis creates a situation where the mucus is like glue and the glue grows bacteria and that causes pneumonia. That is a
Yeah.
real problem. So it's a constant thing. And it was pretty unrealistic. In fact, in about his second or third week at YU, they sent him home. He was too sick to be there.
Mm-hmm.
He's back in the hospital. And we got in touch with YU and we said, is it possible for a kid to imagine that if he's only there like half the time, that he could ever graduate from YU? And Mikey came back to the YU a couple weeks later, and there was a note on his door, go see the dean. He went to see the dean, and the dean said to him, young man, you're going to graduate from Yeshiva University. Whatever it takes, we will get you through.
Who was the dean at that time?
Good question. I know that, but names escape me as age progresses.
I'm sure one of our listeners will be able to
Oh,
match
for
it
sure.
up.
I've got 17 emails about that.
Yeah, there's guys
So
out there.
what-
Wait, so
Yeah,
so what happened was he was 3 weeks in. We bought him a car. He drove back and forth. He put 125,000 miles on a car.
He drove back and forth from Pittsburgh to.
He was
Yeah.
physically able to do that? Like you weren't scared to?
Probably not, but
Okay.
he did.
But he
anyway.
he's the.
I mean, there were a couple of times. We once came back from Israel, and he was supposed to go to school, and I was supposed to fly back to Pittsburgh, and you could tell it was a different age before 9/11 because I gave him my ticket. He flew back to Pittsburgh, and I drove his car back to Pittsburgh.
Like they're like Judge Dan Butler. Thank you for
Right,
boarding.
they didn't even bother.
879.
But he, after 3 years, he ran for vice president of the student council. I mean, of the student body, because he didn't think it was fair to run for president. He was only there half the time. But he won with no problem. And then in his very last term, he got really, really sick, as opposed to just really sick.
Right.
And he ended up back in the ICU, and he needed new lungs, like there was no way back. And at that point, I called YU and said, look, I know there's a rule. If a guy is out for 3 weeks and there's no excuse or whatever, you can forfeit the tuition. And we borrowed the money to get him through this last term. Like, is there some way you could bank the money? Because it's unlikely that he'll ever come back. But if he does, it would be great if he could finish up or... they called back and said... actually, they didn't call back. A week later... Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb flew to Pittsburgh and in the executive offices of the Greater Pittsburgh International Airport awarded Mikey Butler his diploma, made the front page of the paper and the evening news from YU. Mikey got there by ambulance with oxygen and
And he fulfilled his dream.
yeah.
What like sparked that interest in him to like, you know, get a diploma from YU? Like what?
Mikey always said, I have cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis doesn't have me.
Mm.
And that was really in one of the strange coincidences of life, right down the street, 300 feet away, was another kid, Rafi, another frum kid in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, on Bartlett Street with cystic fibrosis.
Mm.
And these two guys were two really good friends, both computer whizzes. They would hang out together all the time. They were in the hospital together. And actually, Rafi got very, very sick in Mikey's first week back at YU, and he passed away not too much later. But these two kids, at a certain point, the doctors discovered that adolescents with cystic fibrosis each created their own super germs, and that they could literally, if they breathed on each other, while it wouldn't affect the rest of us who have normal immune systems, they could literally kill each other. There's actually a movie they made called 5 Feet Apart last year. And so suddenly these kids couldn't be together. Well, they never bought that. And they couldn't room together in hospital, but otherwise they just did their own thing. And Rafi passed away, and then eventually Mikey got lung transplants at the last possible second, literally. I mean, at one point he was on a respirator in a very bad way, and we got a call from Indianapolis. There's a 70-year-old man who had an aneurysm. Would we take 70-year-old lungs? And of course we said, yeah, because he was on a one-way trip. And they prepped him for surgery. I actually said vidui with him. And they put him under. And then they got a call from Indianapolis from the team that had come from the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center by Learjet to Indianapolis. They said, no, there's tumors on these lungs. We can't use them. Wow. That was Wednesday. By Friday, he was done. And he, he was on the highest level respirator, and things just weren't good. And the next day, an athlete at the University of Pittsburgh was killed in an accident, and her family gave everything away. That night we met the heart family, we were the lung family, the kidney families, the liver family, the skin family, and the University of Pittsburgh, they do it all. And it was fabulous. It was incredible. He actually went back to the YU graduation. YU changed their constitution so that if you're the vice president of the student body and you graduate before everybody else, you could still be vice president of the student body. Then, he went back to he went to the graduation at Madison Square Garden, and when Rabbi Lamb called him up, he got a standing ovation. It was like the end of a Disney movie.
It must have been some moment for you as a parent.
That was, and. Then he got what turns out to be post-transplant lymphoma. He got cancer from his new lungs, which, they said they give him a particularly heavy-duty chemotherapy, and if you survive the chemotherapy, you're fine. He got the chemotherapy, and they said after that one, it's so powerful that's it. He'll be fine. They were wrong. And it came back a second time, a third time. He got chemo, he got radiation. Eventually, he was the first person anywhere to get stem cell transplants who had gotten a major organ, because your stem cells have to match the person. And you can't match both, if somebody has another organ, you got to match two people. So they'd never tried it before, but they did it. And it didn't work. And that's what did Mikey in.
So,
and what year was that?
2004.
There's a few questions I have for you. So first of all, you said vidui with him at one point.
Right.
Could you take us through that experience? Like, what's it like? I can't even imagine saying vidui with a child.
Vidui is really ultimately probably not for the person who's dying. It's for the person who's left behind. It's kind of a review. It was a novelty experience. Nothing that I would ever recommend doing, especially with a child, etc. But, and as it turned out, it wasn't, that wasn't the time. It's just, it's a cautionary step you take. But we did a lot of hospital. And as a result, what you have to understand is my wife, from the very beginning, when she heard that this kid had a problem that could end his life from the very beginning, she decided she was going to confront it head on. She became a stellar member of the Chevra Kadisha. She wanted to confront death. She has become Pittsburgh's entire Bikur Cholim. There are esoteric, unique operations that you can only get successfully in Pittsburgh. By way of example, families come from all over the world, many from Israel, who have inoperable brain tumors. And there's a doctor in Pittsburgh who's the only one who has successfully gone up the nose without an incision and taken out these brain tumors. And it is absolutely amazing. But these families come to Pittsburgh in a hurry, and they have nothing. And she meets them at the airport and gets some translators and takes care of their meals and does all that stuff. Our lifelong hospital experience has turned to the benefit of all those people. Because she's there for everybody. She had 4 families this past Shabbos, like taking care of, making sure they got meals. She has a whole network of volunteers. It's in a small community.
It seems like Hashem gave you guys some package, and you guys really took the message and created something.
We've been lucky at every juncture, in every way. I started out I'm the only person in my whole family who didn't graduate from YU because I dropped out of YU. I went to the yeshiva in Scranton. Do I look the part?
No, you don't. You don't look like a Scranton.
Why? What's the prototype?
Scranton?
Yeah.
Like Robert Lansky went to Scranton.
Oh, I didn't know Scranton.
Long
was
after me.
Yeah.
I was in the very first class.
I was thinking of The Office.
Oh no, it's different than that. But I think I think my father went to Scranton.
You think?
Yeah, he's a little younger than you, I think.
Yeah, probably.
No, not that much.
Well, but I went to Scranton in its very first year. I went from the beginning. And I mean, it'll give you an idea of the low standards they had. When my parents and I went to Queens to meet the Rosh Yeshiva for a faher, they actually grabbed my hand, felt for a pulse, and said, "You're in."
Really?
Now, there was
That was the first year, I guess.
that's a true story.
That's amazing.
But
getting in yeshiva nowadays,
Right.
it's a donate a heart.
so I went from Scranton to YU, but I dropped out of YU, and everybody else in my family in every direction all graduated.
So Mikey just wanted to one up you. That's what
That might be it. Yeah.
So,
but I went to work for NCSY,
Okay, tell us about that.
Yeah.
and that was a long time ago. I became the regional director of Central East Region.
How long is NCSY around for?
Well, probably 60 years.
Wow, it's a long time.
I know I spoke at the Shabbaton they had about 10 years ago for the 50th anniversary, so it's probably 60 years. On my very first Shabbaton, which was when your parents were young, very young. I tell kids at NCSY Shabbatons now that if your grandmother was in NCSY, I was the advisor.
So you look pretty young. You're talking like you're 85, though. I have no idea how old you are.
Not quite, but
You look amazing.
Could we ask how old you are?
you could ask. Yeah,
Oh,
sure. You
yeah,
could
okay.
ask, absolutely.
How old are you?
Well, I'm not quite 70. Going to be 70 in a month.
You're young.
You do not.
You're
Come on.
young.
Does he look like he's going to be 70?
No, but you're young. That's not old.
Well, yeah, nowadays, I mean, in the old days, people at
But
the age
still,
of
I
65
thought
would go
you
to
were
the
in
home.
your, like,
You have a very rich
60s,
life, though. You have a lot of
60s.
experience.
So
in
that's what
your-
I'm telling you. I got involved in NCSY, and on my very first day, I met the guy who is my best friend in the whole world. I met the guy who taught me the whole malacha in NCSY and mentored me to this day, and I met my wife. All on that very first day.
What date
That's
was
a
that?
lot.
What was that date?
December of 1970,
December what?
December 24th.
Get out of here. My
Yeah.
wedding anniversary is December 23rd.
Oh, there you go.
We were so close to having this, like
Same that link.
we were so close to like having such a moment, but
But
actually, was it the 24th? No, the 23rd.
my wife
Your wife's not listening.
was in high school at the time, and I had to wait 7 years. She eventually made her way to Stern from public school, and 7 years later we went out, and we got married like 3 weeks. I mean, we got engaged like 3 weeks later.
Because you knew each other.
Zap. Well, kind of. you
Right.
know, but
Knew So we
so,
were,
but that's what I
yeah.
started to tell you. And so NCSY opened me up to a whole world of Kiruv, which was incredible. Like my area was from Mishawaka, Indiana to McKeesport, Pennsylvania, from Sarnia, Ontario down to Fort Knox, Kentucky. And I traveled more than 1,000 miles a week, every week, all the time, going to all these places, setting up Shabbatons, doing stuff, meeting people, setting up a mechanism that to this day still exists. And I'll tell you my best NCSY story.
Oh,
No,
please.
It's not my best. There's a zillion of them, but I'll just give you one example. In March of 1974, I had a Shabbaton in Cincinnati. We had kids from Cincinnati and Louisville, Kentucky. It was just what we called a local Shabbaton, which meant it was just me telling stories all Shabbos and a guitar player. Harold Fruchter from what was then the Ruach Revival and then Ruach, and he's been a million things. Now I think he's Kol Chaim, but he's fabulous talent. So Saturday night at one of those things, we take 140 kids in buses to ice skating, roller skating, or whatever. And then we'd go back to the Shofar Kumsitz or Sloppy Joe's and pizza and whatever. Cincinnati is in the southwestern corner of Ohio. It's adjacent to Louisville. Even the Cincinnati airport, not to Louisville, to Kentucky. Even the Cincinnati airport is in Kentucky.
Right.
Saturday night, we're going bowling or ice skating or whatever. A rainy, miserable night. Okay? I'm in the lead bus. We have 4 buses. Louis Matzmacher, who is the president for life of the Hebrew Academy in Cleveland, and at that time was the regional president of NCSY, remembers this incident. We pull up to a corner somewhere in rural Kentucky, and there's a kid standing there, a kid who has what we used to refer to as a Jew-fro, which is an afro on a Jew. And in those days, in the 70s, a lot of people, because of the Vietnam War or whatever, a lot of people were wearing those army jackets, fatigue jackets. And he's standing there, he's drenched, and he's hitchhiking. So we're looking at him, he's looking at us. One of the kids on the bus says, I know that kid, he's in my homeroom. I said, is he Jewish? He said, yeah. I said, let's take him. So we take him. He comes wherever it was we went that night. We went bowling or whatever. Then he came back to the shul. We had the kumsitz. He had a sloppy Joe. Then whatever. I wouldn't remember this story all these years later, except that one Shabbos, some years ago, guy comes and knocks on my front door. And he has a whole family with him, and one of those double carriages, and a talis zekel, and a hat, and the whole thing. And he came to tell me that story. That
No Jufro anymore?
No. And why was he in Pittsburgh that Shabbos? He was considering becoming our Rosh Kollel.
Interesting.
Okay, so that
Incredible.
That's
It's amazing.
you just shlach lach machal pnei hamayim. You just throw out your bread and something comes back.
You guys picked him up, and that's
Yeah.
And now
I mean, it has nothing to do with me. It's just he got into the machine, and it's
it's the conductor conducting things. That's what it is.
right, exactly.
So Nahi mentioned before, like, you definitely had a, challenge to go through with everything that happened to Mikey. And one listening might be like, okay, and that's where Dan and his wife had a struggle with, and their family, but you as well have another challenge that you have 2 other children with.
Every kid is a challenge.
Every kid is a challenge. Okay, that's fair.
So
well, how many children do you have?
5.
5. Okay.
I mean, that's always a question when a kid passes away. What do you say after that? Do you say you have 4, or do you say you have 5? But we had 5.
No, I like that answer. Yeah, you have 5 children.
And our number 2 son is just like the perfect kid in every way. Very successful attorney, etc. YU stellar star, and gives a weekly shiur that Rabbi Leibowitz used to come to.
Really?
Yeah. Because it's his neighborhood, his shul.
Really?
And he puts on a Myra McComas to blow your socks off every week. He's incredible. Number 3 kid is autistic. He's and as a result of that autism, another world opened up to us. Like I always say that when we found out about Mikey, our world went from black and white to Technicolor, because we suddenly realized there are all these people out there just stretching out their hands, waiting to help you. It's like the old Verizon commercials. You turn around, there's hundreds of people behind you. With this kid, we had not made contact with him yet. He was 7 years old, and we had not yet made contact.
What does that mean? What do you mean?
Because kids who are autistic, they don't display normal affection. They don't initiate speech. They don't make eye contact.
So he hasn't talked.
He hadn't talked yet. And he didn't look you in the eye. I always say that, he'd be sitting there on the floor, rocking back and forth, holding himself. And if he loved you, and if you went down to his level, and you slowly and gently reached out your hand, he would smack you in the eye. If you get close enough, he'll bite you too. And we had, when I was a kid, my mother used to put an ad in the University of Pittsburgh's newspaper a week before Pesach. Need a Seder? Call this number. And people would call. And, kids would call because the trimester system at the University of Pittsburgh resulted in a lot of kids getting stuck there for Pesach. So most of them were not obviously from whatever, but if they liked the kugel, sometimes they came back every Shabbos. So when we got married and moved next door, we did the same thing, picked up a girl from Philadelphia. And for people who are unfamiliar with the geography of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia's part of New York, Pittsburgh's part of Cleveland, the Allegheny Mountains are in between. It's, it's a mahalach. Yeah. So she wasn't going home for Shabbos. She's coming to my house. And my house is a circus because I've got Mikey, if he's home, is taking dozens of pills. We're banging on his back and chest constantly, and he's coughing up a storm. Our number 2 son is brilliant and spouting off everything he knows and learns. Our number 3 is the most beautiful girl in the world. which I always tell the story, if you would expect me to say that because I'm the father. And I always tell the story of Shabbos morning in Shul at the Kiddush. She would get up at age 16 and announce, my brother Mikey's in the hospital. I'm walking down through the snow. It's 4 miles, so it's, and my parents won't let me go alone. Anybody wants to come, we're leaving from my house at 3 o'clock. And 5 to 3, there'd be 36 boys at the front door. And our number, that's number 4. She's the only girl. One girl's easily a match for 4 boys. But number 3 is Uri, and we hadn't made contact with him. Number 5, interestingly enough, is another Fragile X autistic kid. And he's different because he's a big, good-looking kid. But there's a line right in front of him. On one side of the line is the whole world. On the other side is him. And it's a lifelong work to get him over that line. It takes a lot of medication, a lot of work, and I don't know that we've negotiated it successfully yet. But so we had a lot going on.
Yeah.
And this college girl we have from Philadelphia, she looks at this whole crew and she sees that the one we have not yet made contact with is Uri, number 3, the one sitting in the corner rocking back and forth. And she says, well, my brother has Down syndrome. And this past summer, he went to this camp in the Catskill Mountains he ought to think about because they really did wonders with him. And I'm thinking, you're a nice kid, but you're a kid. You don't get it. I have a kid you can't communicate with. He's never been away from us for 10 minutes. How in the world are you going to explain to him that you leave him someplace for the whole summer and you're coming back? People don't realize this. HASC is the only camp in the world that provides an entire summer for special needs. I say kids, but they're a lot. They have age range that's incredible. So it never even entered our minds. But then when she got married, that summer, and there was something with her family, whatever, they had the wedding in Pittsburgh, and I always say there's an almost universal custom among Jews outside of New York that if you go to a wedding and you're assigned to a particular table, you greet the other people at the table.
Good one. I get it.
So I went to the table. And there was only one guy at the table.
Attention New Yorkers. Get the point.
There's only one guy at the table I didn't know. And I reach across the table. Shalom Aleichem, I'm Danny Butler. You don't have enough time this week or next week for me to tell you literally hundreds of stories of people whose lives have been transformed as a result of the web of relationships that grew out of that handshake over a table 31 years ago. People who were going to die didn't die. They got livers and kidneys and hearts and lungs and eyes. People who had no place to be buried people who were mired in misery or living happily ever after with healthy children in wedded bliss. I can't begin to tell you all the things that have happened over the years because of that. And our kid went to Camp HASC. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned.
Whose handshake? Whose end was
the
that?
guy running Camp HASC.
Who's that? What's his name?
At the time it was Mike Kahn.
Awesome.
Wow.
And I always tell the story. Once at Camp HASC, I saw him. He was, the music was blasting. It was like Mordechai Ben David and the band and all, it's just like you can't hear yourself think. And he's standing and dancing with one of the kids who's in a wheelchair and can't move at all, but he's holding that kid's hands and he's dancing and that kid is kind of smiling. Okay. And then a few minutes later, I see him with a gorgeous little red-headed baby. And he says to me, and he mouths to me, it's my granddaughter. Okay. And he's dancing with that kid. And then a few minutes later, I look again, and he's dancing again with another kid in a wheelchair. And it occurred to me right then and there, and this tells you all you need to know about the Kahn family that started Camp HASC and that has maintained it to this day. He didn't have to put that baby down. He was very happy with that grandchild. But they see their mission as being bigger than that. And it was an amazing, as they say in Yiddish, it was an amazing Einfall to see that and to absorb it.
Isn't it incredible? I mean, we're listening to your story, and there's so many different parts of it, and the amount of hashgacha pratis that is taking place every step of the way is just
you can't begin to imagine. So, and people don't understand about HASC. There are 3 components to HASC. If you have a kid, there are kids at HASC who are so involved that they require 3 full-time counselors on them all the time.
Right.
For medications, for ointments, I won't even describe to you some of the things that they have because they have every form of disability. And for those kids, it's so incredible to be the object of that attention, constant 24 hours. It makes a giant difference. The best example is that my son Uri, visiting day the very first time, we show up, 3-4 weeks in, we didn't know what to expect because, he's not.
And you had still not made contact with him at that point?
Right.
Right.
And if it's a nice day, 1,000 people come to see Camp Hask. It's a
Right.
remarkable place. So I couldn't even imagine how we were going to find him. And he pops up in the crowd. And for the very first time in his life, he makes obvious effort at eye contact. And he says, "I love you, Abba," before disappearing into the crowd again,
Wow.
giggling hysterically. And of course, for anybody else, it's not a big deal. But in my house, that's worth $1 zillion. And that started him off to the point where now, 31 years later, they refer to him as the mayor of Camp Hask. And he really thinks he runs the place. He walks around saying, "You're fired. You're fired."
Wow.
The classic. But here's the thing. For that kid, changed his world.
Right.
He's built him a personality.
Changed his world and also changed your world in a
For sure.
way.
No question about it. But the parents of those kids, if you have a kid like that and you don't have a lot of resources, you have to play heads up all the time. Because those kids are runners, or they do things, or they eat things, or they get into accidents. There's got to be somebody. You can't just send the kid to the store.
Right.
There's got to be somebody on that. And I say kid, mine is 38 years old, going on maybe 7. Okay. It's an incredible, incredible vacation. More than a vacation. It's a respite for the parents. I remember a parent of a really seriously autistic kid who could not be communicated with and was also violent, who was spending the summer in camp, giving the parents an incredible respite. And the mother said to me on visiting day, they have one kid, this one kid. She said, "Do you know what we did one night last week?" She said, "We went for a walk." Because you can't leave a kid at home alone, even kids 20. If it's, and probably the most important thing that Hask does, and it's overlooked by almost everybody, is that in the last 40, 50 years, Hask is almost 50 years old, there have probably been 12, 13,000 counselors there. There is not one person who ever spent a whole summer, including my kids, as working at Camp Hask, whose lives were not transformed forever. It's changed them. It's changed the society that we live in. When I grew up, when I was your age, I had never seen any special needs kids. They weren't around. They were hidden away.
Really?
We never saw. I never knew any.
Right. Right.
And in fact, the Kahns, their mother, a European lady who went away to Denver to get a master's degree in special ed, whatever, came back and started to take kids into their house. Kids on the block would call it the retard house because it was unheard of. Mm-hmm. And they've changed everything.
So you attribute, society has come an extremely long way, I guess specifically the Frum community. You attribute to that acceptance to the camps that have
I'm
been
involved with
created.
the OU and Hask. and the NCSY and Yachad and and there are a lot of all sorts of wonderful organizations out there. Mm-hmm. Hask really were the pioneers.
Right.
When Camp Kaylee was started out and they needed counselors, and a counselor called up and said, "Well, I worked at Camp Hask for 4 years." Okay, you're hired.
Right.
Because the Hask counselors are the SEALs, the Navy SEALs of the special needs world.
But it took one person's idea and thought to change an entire stigma.
And somebody, she didn't just do it on her own. She brought her husband into it. She brought her children into it. They devoted their lives to it. They worked at it. They brought it home. They made it their home. They opened homes.
And there's so many more programs nowadays. You have Special Children's Center, you have Yachad.
Endlessly.
And they're all needed.
Yeah. And suddenly they're all needed. It's because suddenly there's so many more. Some people say that. I don't really believe it. They just didn't exist before. They were hidden.
Right. It's incredible. I heard that Uri's vice president of Smiles
for NCSY, Central East NCSY, where I was the regional director 50 plus years ago. We're still involved with it. And Uri goes to the Shabbatons. He wears a suit and a tie. I mean, he's 38 years old and he gets elected every year.
Nice.
Okay. He stands on the stage at the Shabbatons and he leads the band, whether they're playing or not. And kids come by and say Good Shabbos to him, and he said Good Shabbos to them. And Yachad used to integrate into all the NCSY Shabbatons. So we used to have a girl from Cleveland who would come to the Shabbatons. A girl, I say she's a girl. Last time I saw her, she's probably 40. She'd come to the Shabbaton, and there would be an advisor from Yachad who would teach her a Dvar Torah or help her read it, and she would read it. And you'd have 300 crazy, rambunctious, hormonally driven, mostly public school kids. And they would be totally silent at lunch on Shabbos for 5 minutes, listening to a Ahuva from Cleveland. And it might have been the same Dvar Torah every time for years. I never understood really what she said, but it didn't matter because they didn't either. But that experience is something I never had when I was that age. And they sit and they learned, if they learned nothing else but to give that girl the derech eretz, made a tremendous difference. It was part and parcel of everything they learned in NCSY. And, they don't do it. They don't integrate it as much anymore because Yachad has kind of gone its own way. But all this started with Ask.
Right.
It didn't exist 50 years ago.
They changed our world.
Yeah.
For everybody.
Sure. For sure. In the same way that NCSY has too.
Right.
You meet, you don't even know that they're public school. There are great rabbanim that you would be astounded to find out are public school kids who came up through NCSY.
What does NCSY stand for, by the way?
National Conference of Synagogue Youth.
Didn't know that. Okay.
It's an OU derivative.
Right.
It is part of the OU?
Yeah, sure.
I know that.
The OU, if you go on their website, there's like 17 things that they're a part
Yeah.
of.
Oh,
Well, probably
like,
more than that.
The OU
Old off now
earns...
also. An old
Yeah,
person.
everything.
Yeah,
But it's funny because everyone, like, the first thing someone thinks of is the Hachshar,
Right.
which is not even like, it's
The
world
Hechsher
changing.
is a massive business.
No, for sure.
And they use that money to do all those other things,
Right.
particularly to drive NCSY.
I know, but there's so many different, like, if you take their Heckscher side of it, you'd think there's so many more random projects that the OU then funds, which has nothing to do with kashrus and food.
No,
That's
right.
what's so
Right.
interesting about it. And I've definitely heard people ask, is the OU from the food the same as the Orthodox Union that is funding all these projects? They've become such a huge
It's the food
part
that
of
funds those
Jewry.
projects. You have to understand, when I started with NCSY, working for NCSY, we had a national staff meeting at the OU's offices at 84 Fifth Avenue. We all sat around a table. Rabbi Beryl Wine had just taken over the OU. And
I didn't know that.
We had an interview with him.
Yeah, we should have researched that
he's
part.
great. Yeah, he was.
Yeah.
And then he ran the kashrus for a while. But anyway, when they have national staff meetings now, they have them in Stanford and they have 400 or 500 people from all over the country.
Right.
Because it's become a massive operation. And
Who started the OU?
Reb Chaim OU.
who started the OU?
Yeah, what do you know, like,
I don't know.
That's a good
I mean,
question.
I can't off the top of my head.
Before
I
your
can't tell
time?
you.
Yeah.
For my time.
Yeah, OU's
you like to hear
Yeah,
that,
the
huh?
OU is 100.
You like that something's before your time.
So I want to transition to what you're doing. I know Nahi has a question particularly about how you help couples, but right before then, we live in a time where unfortunately anti-Semitism is on a rise, and who better to speak about who better to speak about what they see, what's going on from the court side than from judge.
Look, when people talk about anti-Semitism in America, they talk about Tree of Life as starting off a whole thing. Let me tell you about Tree of Life.
Yeah.
Okay. It tells you a lot about conservative Judaism in America, that the Tree of Life was a synagogue with a sanctuary, a main shul that held 1,400 people. It hadn't even been used in 3 years. 3 congregations had coalesced and were using that building. And at 10 o'clock that morning on October 27th, 2018, there were 22 people in the building, including 2 of the 3 rabbis and the janitor, Augie. Okay. I'll just tell you a few little things. That Shabbos, we heard about it. We were going to show you. The man had a list. He had 3 places on the list. We were number 3. That third shul was the only Orthodox shul. And they had 500 people there for the Itzkowitz Bar Mitzvah.
Wow.
And we heard the police coming from everywhere. Jason Lando is the was the commanding officer of Zone 5. Pittsburgh has 6 police zones. On a Shabbos morning, on a Saturday, there's only one police commander on duty. He was the guy. He was 3 blocks from Tree of Life when he got the call. And he had his bar mitzvah in Tree of Life. He went to Hebrew school at Tree of Life. And his grandfather was one of the few people who went there every single day in his 90s. And this isn't a frum shul, but to put it into perspective for people, I point out that there are 45,000 Jews in Pittsburgh, and probably 44,200 of them did not go to shul that Shabbos. Okay? Jason Lando's grandfather didn't go to shul that day because he called Joyce and told her, who was his regular ride, and said, Joyce, I fell. I don't think I'm going to go today. Joyce went and got killed. He didn't go. But when Jason Lando got there, he didn't know if his grandfather was inside. And if you listen to the tape of him talking to the dispatcher, his voice breaks when she says, who do I send? And he says, send everybody. And they did. You know, you saw in Florida, the police stood around outside. Pittsburgh police ran inside. Tim Mattson, 250 pounds special forces
You're
guy.
talking about Parkland.
Parkland, right.
The school.
Deputies stood outside.
Right.
In Pittsburgh, Tim Mattson was the first guy on the SWAT team as it entered the building. He's like 6'4", 250 pounds, covered with tattoos. He's what you would expect.
Yeah.
He's wearing a whole Kevlar outfit. He was there 11 minutes after he got the call. I can't choose shoes in 11 minutes. And he went through that door straight. He just ran right through that door, took 11 bullets. Now, if you know anything about guns, an AR-15's bullets are like 5 inches long, 7.62 millimeters, and they curlicue. They spiral. So if it hits the finger, it could take a whole hand. And he took 11 bullets, 3 of them in his chest plate, and the rest skittered all over his body, including one that went through his helmet and breezed around his head. And I took Rabbi Weinrib from the OU and Rabbi Dratch from the RCA, the Rabbinical Council of America, into the ICU to see him a couple days later. And I'm good with the police, to say the least. So I took them in there, and Rabbi Weinrib gave him a bracha. The whole SWAT team was there. And these guys, they're not the kind of guys you meet in shul, okay? These are really serious dudes. They all cried.
Wow.
How did he survive that?
So he's back.
He's back on his
Tim
feet.
Mattson's back, yeah. I mean, these guys are, but that's the point. That day, Mincha time, that day, it's a short Shabbos in end of October, at the corner of Forbes and Murray, which is 2 blocks from my house in the center of Squirrel Hill, thousands of people, not our people, thousands of people gathered there. Pittsburgh was mad.
Yeah.
And they stood there in the rain, not saying anything. Thousands, blanketed for blocks around. And I'll tell you 2 more things from Tree of Life. The Tree of Life is around the corner from the police station. Next door to the police, they zoomed over from there. First cop who went in got shot as he opened the door before Tim Mattson. They were there in a minute. But next door to the police station is the fire station. Most appropriately in Squirrel Hill, it's number 18 fire station. And the firemen are incredibly welcoming to special needs adults. David and Cecil Rosenthal were the 2 youngest people in shul that day. They're 2 Fragile X autistic brothers. I've had them at my Shabbos table. They would go every morning at 8 o'clock to Tree of Life from their group home run by Achieva, which is obviously not Jewish operation that my wife happens to be the president of. And they would have lunch. They would have breakfast with Augie the janitor. And then David, the one who didn't really talk, would go in and straighten out the Sidurim and the Talesim. And then he'd sit in the front row waiting for the service to start. Cecil was much more outgoing, big, gregarious guy. They used to call him the greeter. And he would stand in the back, and if somebody came in, he'd say, Shabbat Shalom, welcome to Tree of Life, and he'd hand a guy a sitter and a talis. I'm sure he did that to that guy when he walked in that day. And the guy shot him. The guy used 131 of those big bullets on 11 people.
Wow.
Plus the other hundreds of bullets. So the rabbi immediately recognized what it was and tried to drag the 3 people who were sitting in the front row, David and 2 others, to the exit that was behind the Aron Kodesh. But David pulled away, making some sort of sound, and ran back up the aisle to where his brother was lying in a pool of blood. And David, who didn't really talk much, was heard to say, right before he was shot, "I want to go home." So they were the first funeral. And everybody went to everything. Suddenly, a lot of the normal ideological lines that, here are giant walls, nothing mattered. Everybody went.
Right.
So the first funeral was these 2 brothers. Thousands of people were there. The Pittsburgh Steelers had 2 busloads. The governor, the mayor, the Israeli consul, everybody was there. And they're all standing room only in this giant place with the 2 coffins in the front. Total silence. And then the door opens, and the number 18 fire company, dressed in their dress whites, march down the aisle, and one by one, they march forward, stand in front of the 2 coffins, salute, turn around and march out. And the fire chief said later about an autistic guy that you couldn't have a normal conversation with, who for the last 20 years had visited one of the fire stations, and they let him sit in the seat or play on the thing or whatever. The fire chief said, "I thought David would like that." It's a uniquely Pittsburgh moment, but these are not Jewish people. That's the point. Right. Every single storefront in the whole county had a sign outside, a variation on the Pittsburgh Steelers logo where they added a Magen David. Stronger than hate. There were giant billboards, stronger than hate. The Pittsburgh Steelers put that on their shoes. Mm-hmm. The Pittsburgh police put a stronger than hate logo on their cars. I mean, it was everywhere. Right. If you can imagine a Magen David on a police car. And then there's the mayor, and it's worth telling you about the mayor, a guy named Bill Peduto, certainly not a Jewish guy. Bill Peduto, in the days after that, went to the schools, the 3 day schools in Pittsburgh, for lunch. Brought a squad of policemen with him. Sat with the kids, ate lunch, because everybody was, of course, nervous. I mean, you'd see people walking down the street, adults, and they'd see each other, and they'd put their arms around each other and cry. In fact, I'll tell you, the Chaver Kadisha is run by Rabbi Wasserman. And I would say Wednesday after that Shabbos, the guy who had flown in immediately, the FBI guy in charge of gathering evidence, who had been there, I think he was there 24 hours a day the whole time. By Wednesday night, he and Rabbi Wasserman were embracing and crying. I mean, it was just such a horrific scene. But the mayor would come to the schools, or came to the schools, and he sat with the kids and he said, "I'm Bill Peduto, I'm the mayor of Pittsburgh. These police work for me. Their job is to protect you, and they're going to do that. I'm going to leave a few of them here to take care of you. Don't worry about anything." And then, and this should give you you have to have an immense historical perspective to appreciate this, but Bill Peduto, after all the shivas, nobody could have a shiva in their house. Thousands of people can't come to your house. Right. The JCC opened up for people to have shiva. I mean, it was incredible. It was a community thing that just went on and on and on.
Not the type of thing you would imagine to happen in Squirrel Hill, right, of all places.
So we had rallies, and we had and the shivas, and everything was public. When it was all over, the mayor announced that we're going to have a rally against hate on November 9th, Friday, November 9th. It's going to be downtown at Point State Park, which is the big bar. And Tom Hanks was in town in Squirrel Hill, where they were filming Mr. Rogers' movie, because Mr. Rogers lived a couple blocks from me.
Wow.
And
wait, can we pause for a second?
Sure.
Did you know Mr. Rogers?
Oh yeah.
No, okay, we'll get to that next. I'm obsessed with Mr. Rogers.
That's cool.
So
we will get to that. Yes, I'm glad that.
He announced Tom Hanks is going to be there. Michael Keaton, who's from Pittsburgh, is going to be there. He had all the big guns were going to come. And 2 days before, they said, "Mayor, you got to cancel it. Do it another date, because there's going to be a monsoon that day. We just can't do it that day." And he said, "No, we're doing it that day. And people will bring umbrellas. They'll bring ponchos. They'll come. We're going to have it." So they had it. And then the very next week, in Pittsburgh's Jewish paper, which is a weekly, I guess all Jewish papers these days are weeklies, the mayor of Pittsburgh took a full-page ad that said the following. On November 9th, 1938, government leaders turned their backs on Jewish citizens in Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. On that day, police officers and emergency officials turned their backs. On that day, community leaders turned their backs to death, destruction, and violence, that led to the Holocaust. On November 9th, 2018, government officials and leaders stood in support of our Jewish community in Pittsburgh. On that day, police officers and emergency officials spoke out against hatred. On that day, community leaders denounced anti-Semitism. On that day, we stand united that hate against one is hate against all. We are Pittsburgh. We are stronger than hate. And then, almost poetically, he signed it, "Never again, Bill Peduto, Mayor of Pittsburgh." Now, you guys don't know where "Never Again" came from because it's all over the place. But Mayor Kahana is the one who originally said "Never Again." That was his. And it's nice for us to say it, but it doesn't mean as much as it does for the mayor of the non-Jewish mayor of a large American city to say it. In fact, he's gone all over the world, and he's quoted what I told him, that this may be the first time in history that armed municipal officials burst into a shul to protect the Jews. He's been very proud of that.
As he should be, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, so the truth of the matter is, we had one crazy, evil, I don't want to say crazy because that's a legal term, but we had one evil, awful person who came and did a horrible thing. In Pittsburgh, he's never referred to by name. He's just called the shooter. We don't, we're not John Wilkes Boothing him. But we saw such an outpouring from our community. It was incredible. Absolutely incredible. My grandson, what you should do is go on YouTube and put in Pittsburgh Mother, because that Sunday morning, everything was closed. And my daughter baked cookies with her kids and took them to the police lines outside of Tree of Life and handed out cookies and posted these things, "Thank you to the police." And because there were all these TV cameras there, they interviewed her. So it went viral on Yeshiva World after that. It's worth it to hear Shoshi's little discussion with them about what happened.
So I want to get into how you. I don't want to spoil it, but Nachi's going to ask about it. You know what I'm referring to, Nachi?
I think I can figure it
Okay,
out.
but before that, and you mentioned, and I really do want to get to this. You personally knew Mr. Rogers? You've seen him?
I mean, yeah, sure. I'll tell you.
He's
One
someone who's
Shabbos-
not Jewish.
You're fangirling.
No, I grew up watching Mr. Rogers. I really did, and
It was all filmed at WQED, a mile
I
from
think
my house.
he really revolutionized like what it is to teach children, and he's someone who's not alive and is not Jewish, but I would have loved to have him on here. But
at Levias, they quoted him because
Right.
what he always said was,
I know you're going to say it, but yeah, say it.
yeah, that when
Terrible things.
things happen, look for the people who help.
Right.
So when dozens and dozens of mental health professionals and counselors, et cetera, volunteered to talk to people who came in off the street at the JCC, at the Jewish Community Center in the heart of Squirrel Hill for weeks afterwards, they wore little badges that said helper.
Wow.
That's so awesome.
Wait, hold on. So you get to hold on. I want to wait. Tell
So
me
I'll
something
tell you-
about Mr. Rogers that
I'll
I
tell you
don't
one
know.
Mr. Rogers anecdote. I mean, he gave us a whole tour of his. I have a video actually of the family visiting the whole set and going through the whole
I'm
thing.
totally gonna off camera ask you for that
But
video. Yeah.
one Shabbos, we're walking
Maybe
to
he
shul.
can sign it for you because he saw Mr. Rogers.
It's a winter Shabbos. We're walking to shul, and Mikey was a cough machine. I mean, he was just
Right.
he would cough, and sometimes he'd just stand there and cough and cough and cough. So we're standing in front of H. Drucker Taylor's on Murray Avenue in Squirrel Hill, and Mikey's coughing, and we're on our way to shul, and we're just standing there watching him cough. And Mr. Rogers comes out of the tailor shop, and he crouches down, he looks Mikey in the eye, and he says, "That's some terrible cold you have." And it startled Mikey so much that he stopped coughing.
That's so funny. That's so nice.
I think that was the first
Was
time
he wearing
met
a
him.
sweater? Was he wearing a cardigan?
I don't remember. But he's lived in the neighborhood. His wife's still there.
So
Right.
we've discussed a lot in this episode so far. We're nearing the hour mark, and we're going to begin to wind down shortly. But just to talk to one of the things that you're still very much involved in today, which is helping couples who are experiencing, I guess, turbulence in their marriage, some who are going towards divorce. What do you do for those couples?
Well, I mean, the truth of the matter is divorce. I spent decades before. Now I do mostly criminal, a little bit of civil stuff, but I spent decades in family court. And we discovered that if you just sit down and talk reasonably to people, you can work. I used to have a business called endittoday.com. People would pay me a flat fee. And for that flat fee, we would take as much time as it was required, and I would settle the divorce, no matter how much they hated each other, no matter how crazy
you would
they
settle
were.
it, meaning you would get them divorced with no, or you would.
We would get a signed agreement that resolved all of their issues, from custody to property. And in 5 years of doing that, I never failed.
Wow.
So what's I mean? So,
Because I can't do that as a judge anymore.
right.
But what we do now is, if there's a young couple in Pittsburgh that's getting divorced,
in the Frum community,
in the Frum community, the VOD will give me a call, and I'll sit and meet with them, and we will work it out, whatever it takes. And
Really?
we always do.
and I'm sure that saves like hundreds of thousands of dollars, a lot of heartache, and a lot of trauma for
Right.
both
A
parties.
mess, just
I was always concerned about whether that was an appropriate thing to do. And in one particular very prominent couple, I saw what it was doing. They were going through the normal divorce procedure. This is many years ago. It's probably 35 years ago. They were going through a horrible divorce, and I saw it was destroying the business, it was destroying the kids, it was destroying the family, and I knew that it would take years. And I went to my Rav and I said, I can walk into this situation, take these people, get the whole divorce resolved, work out all the property, save them hundreds of thousands of dollars in months and whatever. But in effect, what I'm doing is ending their marriage faster.
Right.
Can I do that? And he said something, this was Rabbi Miller, who has since retired and lives in Lakewood. He said something that was brilliant. He said it's the best chance they have for ever getting back together.
wow.
You want to know something? I reserved a courtroom in family court. I got everybody to go along with it. I got the lawyers in. We worked it out. We got a signed agreement. I went. I was an aide at the get. I mean, I did the whole thing. And 6 months later, they got back together and lived happily ever
No
after.
way.
Yeah.
Well, could you like I guess
Wow.
That
dissect?
doesn't happen, by the way.
Right.
Right. You
but
don't have
that's-
to I guess speak about the specifics, but like what is it about that, like ending it cleanly, that
You know, I can't tell you too many of the intimate details.
right?
But I have found that if I sit down, you know, in the way courts are structured, people rarely get a chance to vent and tell their story.
There's a lot of
Right.
red tape that they can.
Right.
This
And
is
being
not
represented.
And what happens, I've been on 10,000 mediations or not really mediations, but conciliations with attorneys. The people are sitting out in the hall glaring at each other across the hall. The lawyers are inside talking to the judge about their kid's Little League game. And finally the judge says, what are we going to tell these people? Okay. And they work something out, and then they come out and say, oh, the judge is going to do this, or if you don't, you know.
And everyone's bank account gets hit
And
for
those
that.
people then call in late night radio shows because they're miserable that they got forced into something and they're unhappy or whatever. And I said, when in family court, I said I could fix this. Like I could do this.
Divorce attorneys probably hate you.
Short circuit. Well, there's some who do, but
So what is it that you
So
do?
what I did was, I volunteered on the day that a custody case came to trial in family court. Everybody, the lawyers, the relatives, everybody who was there would come and we'd sit around the table, try and work out an agreement. If I could work out an agreement, they wouldn't go on to court that day. Otherwise, they'd have a trial that day. In 4 years, I did 1,100 of them. Only 2 ever went to court. And in both of those cases, the lawyer didn't show up and he told the client, don't sign anything. But I discovered that most people only have a certain amount they can tell you. Nobody has more than, I don't care if you're married 25 years and you're married to a madman. You don't have more than 45 minutes worth to tell me. And if I hear it from both sides, after a while, we can work it out.
So what's your system? I mean, you must have a template. You walk in, you like, okay.
Well, now it's a
listen,
lot
and
easier because everybody knows me and everybody knows my, you know.
They know when they're coming in that that's the objective.
Yeah. They
But-
come to me to avoid
Right.
know.
1,100 cases. How, like,
In those cases,
what's the system? Like, what do you? Because
I used
first of all,
to
it could be applied to relationships that are not going for divorce. It could be applied to resolving anything, really. There's so many disagreements that people have, and
exactly right.
so what is it that you're the peacemaker? Is that a
The truth of the matter is, I don't know that I don't have a business model for it. Lots of times something like this is going to get me in trouble because I'm going to get a million calls from people all over the place. Oh, could you?
It's true.
And the truth of the matter is I only do local stuff.
Right.
So
Because I have a tremendous amount of credibility because all of the judges in our family court have either appeared in front of me or I've appeared in front of them. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And I know what they're going to do and I know what they're going to say and I know how it's going to work and I can predict it. So you can spend $300,000-$400,000 in 2 or 3 years fighting about it. And I won't be off by more than a few $1,000s. So what's the point? I always tell the story that I was once Judge Strasburger, who's now dead, was having a custody case, and the family is fighting, and they're literally out in the hall. There's a free for all, and they're fighting over twins, 17-month-old twins. At one point, the mother picks up one of the twins by the leg and hits the father over the head with the kid. And I always tell people, one way or the other, a lot of people do that in family court. That's not what you want to do with your kids.
No.
And needless to say, neither of those kids went home with the parents that night. But the point is that people can listen to reason. Even crazy people can listen to reason sometimes. And I've never been unsuccessful with that.
That's amazing.
But I only do local. You have to live within the confines of Allegheny County, Pennsylvania.
Real estate.
Don't call.
Allegheny County in Pennsylvania. Just shut
Butler
up.
Just moved there. Okay, so we ask people sometimes fun questions, sometimes interesting questions at the end. Start off with, what is your favorite mitzvah, if you have?
Oh, Shatnez for sure. No, I'm just kidding. Hands down, it's Shabbos.
Shabbos.
You know why?
Yeah, why?
First of all, we start Shabbos like Tuesday. And we're done cleaning up from Shabbos on Monday. Okay, Shabbos is our whole life.
Week, yeah.
And it saved us. Because we have 2 kids who otherwise would be totally out of control. And they have learned through years and years and years that we're going to have people at the table who might never see Shabbos again. We have to give them this opportunity. We always have guests. I mean, COVID has really put the kibosh on the whole thing because we have our 99-year-old aunt with us.
Right.
But so we've had to moderate that considerably. But this was our whole lives, even in the hospital. We did a Seder in the hospital one time. Our son had just gotten lung transplants, and he was in the hospital, and there was no way out. And we did our starum in the hospital. And because of Joel Weinberg, he was the vice president of medicine from guy who's now made Aliyah and is the head of cystic fibrosis for the state of Israel. But Joel had a lot of pull, so we could put roaster pans in and refrigerators, and we had Pesach in the hospital. It was astounding how many people who worked in that hospital on those nights came by. Oh, you have matzah? You have charoses? You're having a Seder? Wow, I remember, I heard. It was astounding how many people just had that experience from being there. Mikey was Shabbos in the hospital. Mikey put on a suit, a white shirt, and a tie, even in the ICU. He was, he was like I always say, like the British troops in deepest, darkest Africa who would dress to the nines for high tea, no matter what, because it's Shabbos in the hospital. And he was Shabbos in the hospital over the years to hundreds of people, many of whom had only a peripheral identification with Judaism. And years later, they meet someone somewhere that they tell about it and they remember it. And I hear about it from all over the country, from all over the world.
Wow. Okay.
If you could sit down with one person from history who's no longer with us, spend an hour with them, talk to them, who would it be?
This is actually a question I didn't prepare for, and I probably should have if I were doing a job. But when you get me on the fly like this, I would have to say my father.
Your father. Why your father?
Because he was one of those rare people that I lived with him and worked with him and traveled with him my whole life. And I never saw him or heard him do or say anything that he wouldn't want me to hear or see.
Wow.
And I know my kids can't say that. That was a lifelong thing. This is a guy who went to public school, Probably my best story about him. He went to public school, graduated public school at the age of 15, and went to work because it was the Depression and his father didn't have a job at that time.
Wow.
And supported the family as a teenager.
And he was religious or no?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Oh, yeah. Like they were the only one,
Right.
you know.
Wow.
And he eventually was drafted. He was pretty old when he was drafted. And he went to war for real. He was in on D-Day. I mean, all the way into Germany. And I videotaped him with my kids. You know, tell his story. At that point, we were videotaping him in his house, which was the big house in front. And,
Which is your house.
Yeah.
Oh, well, not now.
That's your kid's house now.
Yeah.
No, that was his house then, and my house was my house at that.
Right. Sorry.
But he had a room air conditioner. It was making too much noise because he was too quiet, and I couldn't capture him on the mic. So we went back to my house, which has central air, to finish the interview. And my kids wanted to know. They had all kinds of questions, and I said, "Did you ever miss putting on tefillin?" He could not remember the name of his commanding officer that he went all the way into Germany with. I mean, they were at the tip of the spear. He was in an advanced unit. But he remembered distinctly the one cold winter day in France where he was on guard duty and it got dark before he had a chance to put on his tefillin. And 50 or 60 years later, he was able to talk about that day because that was what was important. So yeah, he's probably the one.
Wow.
What's the best advice that you've ever received?
The best advice? Marry her.
Yeah. What was the worst advice?
You know, I thought about that. I actually did think
Marry her
about
in
that.
7 years.
Well, actually, but I don't know that that any bad advice stands out.
Okay.
I've always, a lot of it has been good for how kol tali b'mazel afilu l'sefer Torah shebeheichal. Everything's dependent on mazel. Why? Why for the sefer Torah? Because there's 10 sefer Torah in the Aron Kodesh to be picked. You got to be lucky, and I've been very, very fortunate.
That's
So
beautiful.
I want to finish off with that statement that you feel lucky. Someone might see you and see the challenges and barriers in your life and be like, how could they meet you and be like, he's a small guy, you lost your son, you have 2 children with autism. How do you get that, I guess, emunah or bitachon to just go through and say, I'm lucky?
Mikey lived more in his 24 years than most people do in 100 years. Mikey's 2 autistic brothers are they're much younger in many ways. And it's like having perpetual children. Every yontif, every Shabbos, everything. Our son Uri, who I told you is 38 years old. You could find him at 4 o'clock in the morning when the house is completely his and there's no noise and and he can do whatever he wants. He's sitting with his mother's Shabbos book because the configuration of the tables determines how many people we're going to have, or how many people we're going to have determines the configuration of the tables. And he's planning for Shabbos in his head. He'll sit on the front porch because we're all the way in the back and people come up the walk. He'll sit on Friday night, regardless of the weather, and tick off in his head the people who are coming, and he won't come home until everybody's there. But you couldn't have a normal conversation with him. You can't send him to the store. But that keeps everything alive. And that's why I go back to Shabbos again. Everything is Shabbos.
Wow.
And it's our social life. It's our goal. It's our happiness. It's our respite. It's everything. I will tell you one more thing. 18 years later, Mikey just had his 18th yard site last week. One of the families of one of his classmates never got over the experience they had of being with Mikey, and made a substantial contribution to Yeshiva University to open a scholarship fund, which hopefully is growing as we speak, that Yeshiva University announced last week. And that will be, it's specifically for a kid who lives outside of the New York metropolitan area and who never went to a day school. So that somebody out there will have the opportunity, hopefully every year, to enter YU and have that experience.
That's beautiful.
That's really beautiful.
Judge Dan Butler, we really appreciate you taking the time and telling us your story. I'm certain that it's going to inspire many people. So thank you.
Thank you.